So hi everyone. So I was there earlier this week, but now actually, funny enough, I'm on Catalina Island doing some drone mapping today. So today I'm going to talk to you about how our group here at CSUMB is not only using drones for coastal research, but also how we're starting to adapt them to study the rocky InterTidal. And just give you a little bit of my background. I'm Corey Garza, professor in the Marine Science Department there at Cal State Monterey Bay. As part of my position, I also run a NOAA Center, a National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Cooperative Science Center, within which we have our coastal drone program. So I'm going to talk to you about how we're using those drones to study the rocky InterTidal. There we go. So I'm going to start off with this paper that came out almost 9 years ago now by Kintich, and it was titled "A Sea Change for Use Oceanography." And within it, what it describes is what Kintich describes as the 21st century ocean scientists. And this came about as a result of a workshop that was held at the National Academy of Sciences in conjunction with the Office of Naval Research, NSF, and NOAA, where those groups were trying to discuss what the sort of 21st century ocean scientists should have in their toolkit. And one of the main tools that came out of there was autonomy, or knowing how to use autonomous technologies, in large part because one of the things that was being faced at the time and still today is that the budget for large ocean-going endeavors were shrinking and shrinking. And so we needed new ways to try to cover what ships used to cover in the past. And so autonomous technology, AI and robotics were sort of highlighted as the types of skill sets that modern ocean scientists were going to need to have going ahead. And you can even see some of these sort of areas being adopted by some of the major research and funding entities in the US. For example, these are NOAA's most recent research and technology focus areas. And if you look at the top there, one of the main ones that they're focusing on is AI, machine learning, and unmanned systems, or what they call now uncrewed systems, for advancing mapping and coastal monitoring. You're also seeing things like eDNA, as well as data and cloud proficiency. And so these approaches are rapidly being adopted into the modern ocean science STEM workforce. And you can actually go and take a look at, the field that I'm in marine ecology, is we've been a little slow to adopt some of these methodologies because we've actually tend to rely on methods that really haven't changed since the early 1960s. In particular, the types of things that we tend to use are things like meter tapes, which you can see in the top left. There are some students of mine about 8 or 9 years ago up in British Columbia. Quadrats, which you can see there on the bottom left there. You can actually get percent coverages of some of the animals there. Point contact methods. Look at those couple of photos there from the 1980s, actually where I'm at here on Catalina Island right now. And so really things just really haven't changed over time. Now, one of the reasons that we've used these methods is they're an easily replicated data collection approach, but there are some limitations that are really starting to pop up, especially as the questions that we're being asked to address in intertidal systems are becoming ever more complex. One, you have limited spatial coverage. You can't cover a lot of area using these methods. In fact, you only cover the tide zones there. They're pretty time intensive. So if you take a look surveying these areas using these methods can take anywhere from 3 to 4 hours at a time. In fact, the site that I was just working at this morning, you would normally take us about 3 to 5 hours using these approaches. The drone knocked it out in a total of about 30 minutes this morning. And they're personnel intensive. You need a lot of people to do that. If you look at those pictures on the right, there's about 3 or 4 folks doing all of this work. Right now, drones can just do it all on their own. So one of the things that we have to come to terms with, I think, in the intertidal community is whether we wanted to or not, automation is coming, and we need to start to think about how we're going to integrate these types of tools into some of the research that we're doing these days. So here at CSUMB, we do have drone-based coastal research that's in large part focused on research and education, being supported by NOAA and more recently by the National Science Foundation. And so our drone program here, it's allowing us to extend both the spatial and temporal coverage and a lot of the coastal research projects that we have there. The other thing that's starting to happen, and this sometimes causes my colleagues a little heartburn, it's allowed us to have a reduction in the required personnel that need to be out there. You're seeing the one of my former students, Taylor, there at the bottom. She's the only one that needs to be out there flying the drone. And it's reduced the amount of time that we need in the field. So for example, this morning, the total time using the boat, getting out to the site, getting the drone deployed, it was a total of an hour over there. So we don't need to be outside all that much anymore to get our information. And where we really started to advance work with our drones, it's using these drones in intertidal mapping here. And so we primarily use things like Phantom drones and DJI Mavic, but to do ultra low altitude autonomous mapping. We're using things like Pix4D and Drone Deploy because we can pre-plan missions just as we would with a traditional survey grid. We can upload in those drones and we can sort of repeat those surveys within, plus or minus a few centimeters each time. And we get pretty high resolution with these data, anywhere from 1 to 2 centimeter image resolution. So what I'm going to do now is just walk you through a bit of sort of the infrastructure that we do have here at CSGMB. So we have the DJI Mavic 2 Pro and the Phantom 4 Pro. These tend to be the workhorses when we're doing intertidal research. And so they're, the Mavic 2, we tend to use those. Two of them are Viserion and Rhaegal that we have, those are the two little dragons from the Game of Thrones. These have a 20 megapixel camera and 4K video. And we use these for really low altitude habitat surveys, anywhere from 2 to 5 meters above the ground. We will normally pair this up with something like a Phantom over there. We have one right now that's dedicated to the center. It's got the same camera setup, but we'll use this for anywhere for surveys that are anywhere from 10 to 20 meters above intertidal site. One of the reasons we do that is then we can integrate this ultra low altitude data that we're getting with the Mavic with a sort of a larger overview of the site that we're mapping there. And we can in general, we can knock this out in just about 30 minutes or so. You might have seen a little bit earlier, with Pat, some past presentations, we also have the DJI Matrice 210. This is our heavy payload quadrider drone. So if we also want to do something like doing multispectral mapping of the water just offshore the site there, this allows us to do that. There. We actually own two of these. One has a dual gimbal, the other has a single gimbal. This particular one there, it's named Drogon, after the giant dragon that was there in the Game of Thrones. We also recently invested in the Firefly 6, which is a vertical takeoff and landing fixed wing drone. One of the advantages, it can be launched from offshore platform like boats. In fact, we had to do that this morning with our smaller drone there. And in fact, some of the intertidal sites that we work on, you can really only access them from a boat. This one has a 42 megapixel camera, though you can actually swap in things like multispectral and LiDAR systems as well, if that winds up being of interest. And so this is actually really great when you have extended range mapping missions. We need to map really large stretches of the shoreline, and you're not too worried about monitoring things or seeing things like barnacles or individual lipids on the rock. Just so you know that we're not just sort of into just one area of sci-fi and fantasy. We have our newest group of drones that we call the Rogue Squadron here. These are RTK enabled drones that we bought within the last year or so. We have a DJI Phantom 4 RTK drone. So this allows us to really have high precision, low altitude mapping. This one's nickname is Rogue 1. And then more recently, we've invested in a Phantom 4 multi-spectral drone. One of the ways that we're thinking about using this is for mapping things like kelp, wetland, and intertidal algae there. And this one has the nickname Rogue 2. The other thing that we've done is we've enabled or sort of developed ways to do autonomous low altitude mapping. So some of the flight apps that you probably work with today, like Pix4D and Drone Deploy, they don't allow you to fly autonomously below 10 meters, which you go, well, that's really low and that's really good resolution. That would be great if I'm working on things like big plants and the like, except I'm trying to sort of map things like barnacles and limpets where just a couple of centimeters in size. So that's not a low enough altitude for me to get the resolution that I need. So we use Lychee. Lychee is a really great app. It allows us to design autonomous flight plans that go below 10 meters. So we use these to construct high resolution intertidal surveys. It's a bit less plug and play relative to Pix4D and Drone Deploy. So the way I describe it, if you're into stats, like Pix4D and Drone Deploy are like something like Jump, where you plug stuff into a spreadsheet and then your operations are already pre-made and you just plug and play there. Lychee is more like R. You have to create things on the fly. There's a lot of troubleshooting that you have to do, and it takes a little bit of practice, but once you get it down, it's a pretty great app to use there. And so what you're seeing here was one of our early runs with our Mavic out at Hopkins Marine Station doing a 2-meter above ground autonomous flight. And one of the things is, once we get this information, we then plug into something like Pix4D, and then we're able to construct these really awesome 3D structure for motion models, which allow us to bring the intertidal back into the lab, where we can analyze and look at patterns a little bit later on. So this is actually one of the sites that we're working this weekend here at Catalina Island, here nearby the USC Wrigley Institute. And so you're looking at one of our runs from a few years ago where the drone did this in about 8 minutes. We got about a 2.5 centimeter image resolution over there. And this is about 30 meters along shore and 2 meters of tidal extent. So we're getting a lot of area in a pretty short amount of time. You can see more recently, we've started working with colleagues here in Monterey at Hopkins Marine Station. Those of you familiar with the area, this is a transect line known as a Hewitt line. It was a transect line monitored by a graduate student last name Hewitt back in the early 1900s and the mid 1990s. A group of researchers went by, resurveyed it, and what they noticed is that the composition of the intertidal had changed. We had more warm water species relative to cold water species that you were seeing back in the early 1900s. So it's one of sort of the early sort of signs that you're experiencing climate change on the coastal environment. So the Hopkins team goes back every year and they survey this. But this past year, they were started interested in using drones here to try to expedite the data collection process. And so this is a pretty substantial area. The transect line's about 60 meters along shore, 60 meters from top to bottom. It's maybe about 30 meters across. And I think the drone did this in about 25 minutes or so. And the other thing that we're able to do here, one of the things they're interested in, is you can take those 3D images and create virtual fly-throughs of them. So one of the things this enables us to do is beyond just doing basic research and monitoring, we can create these virtual experiences and give access to students who might not have access to these field stations. And so it's another thing that the team at Hopkins is looking at, is how can you use this type of drone data, not just to facilitate research and monitoring, but also to facilitate educational opportunities for individuals who might not have access to these particular locations. Then one of the other things that we're starting to do with this particular type of data is we're starting to automate the habitat classification component. So we get a lot of information, right, in a pretty short amount of time. And so historically, what we would have done in GIS, we might have popped, this is one of our photo transects out at Bird Rock here on Catalina Island. We might have put this in GIS and then gone through and hand classify that. And that would have taken a while. It would have taken the better part of a day or two to do that. Now we're using ArcGIS Pro there, and we're actually doing automated classification. What the software is doing, we can train the software to pick up different reflected values of wavelengths of light coming off of the image. So in other words, we can take advantage of the fact that coral and algae reflects light back at a pink wavelength, mussels at a black wavelength, water to blue wavelength, and so on. And we can train the software to identify any pixels that are in those wavelengths. We can classify into these different habitat types. And so now we've gone, so once we train this, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to train the software. And then to classify this only takes 30 seconds to a minute or so, depending on the speed of your computer. And we get about a 90 to 95% accuracy rate in the automated classification there. Takes about a minute or so, and then we actually will ground truth this against field data, field quadrat data, to make sure that we're calling mussels or mussels out and so on. So this is actually currently in review right now with my former graduate student, Taylor Eddy. And so what we're starting to do is expedite the amount of data we can get in a short amount of time in the field, as well as the expediting amount of time it takes for us to actually classify this once we get this back into a computer lab. Now, one of the things I also want to bring up, because I know there's some academics in the audience too, is this is just more than a data collection tool and exercise. It's also giving us new perspectives on intertidal systems that we didn't have before. About a decade or so ago, working with my colleagues, Carlos Robles, Bob DeJarnett, Meekin Donahue, we started testing landscape ecology theory and how it can be used to predict spatial patterns in intertidal systems. And one of the things that we quickly came to realize is the data collection tools we had at the time weren't up to the task of helping us test theory. So we had to start to integrate things like digital photography, GIS modeling to do that. And what it did is it opened up new sort of mechanisms that we didn't really think about were structuring these systems here. And so it led to a whole series of papers that we wrote on the topic. In 2009, we talked about how these systems existed in these multiple equilibria states. People didn't think about these systems in the time at that way. We published in Landscape Ecology, thinking about new mechanisms of how boundaries in these systems form. Megan published in American Naturalist, where we actually, based on our work, we actually came with new intertidal landscape theory about how the landscape actually drives a lot of the processes that structure intertidal systems. And then I did a special review for landscape ecology reports about how we could start to think about integrating technology into basic intertidal research. And so drones have the same potential to give us new perspectives on these systems and open up new avenues of research that we hadn't thought about before. Now, in addition to being a researcher, I'm also an educator, right? And so drones also have a way of increasing access to research opportunities in the Rocky Intertidal research. COVID opened people's eyes to how limited access people had even pre-pandemic. And so one of the ways that we were using the drones here and some of our software was to try to increase access to student opportunities. So on the left there, you're looking at two of our recent graduates, Sarah Kilbane and Jamie Byrne. They were both NOAA Center undergraduates. So they were both Part 107 certified, and they were actually working out in the field because they were allowed to. They were allowed to go out on their own, and so the risk of them getting COVID was a little lower than they were going out in a large team. We also run a research experience for undergraduates program. We had two students in there, Maria Rocha and Ariana Soriano, who weren't able to go out in the field. But what they did is they served as a shore team. And so the way that we had these groups working is you would have Sarah, for example, out here on Catalina Island collecting data, uploading data into images into a Pix4D cloud server, and then Ariana, who was living just outside of San Diego, would then download that data, analyze it, and by the end of the day, we have a fully realized 3D model of our system that was fully analyzed. And so not only were we creating a new type of educational opportunity and access for students, this is actually a new working research model for how my lab works, where now I have a field team working with drones and a shore team that's doing all the image sort of classification and statistical analysis on the back end. And so this is a very different model during InterTidal research and monitoring than we had in the past. And in large part, it was driven by the students, right, helping us to develop this type of model. So just before closing out, I just want to say, if you're interested in following us, we are on the web. You can find us all over social media. We have a Facebook page as well as our Twitter feed and our Instagram feed. We'll be posting stuff out here from Catalina Island this upcoming week. So yeah, so please do go and follow us. And again, if you have any questions, that's my email, and I'm happy to answer any questions with the time that I have left.
Corey, thanks so much for the great presentation. I was curious if you could speak to the software and packages you're using for the automated habitat classification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're using the image classification toolset in ArcPro. And then after we pull data off of that, we analyze in R of jump.
Yeah, I was actually curious if you've coordinated with the Catalina Island Conservancy botanists, because they have a difficult time accessing bird rock due to its private property restrictions, and that there's rare listed species on that island that they would like to monitor.
No, they've never reached out to me. I mean, we've been, the reason we work there, one of that colleague, Carlos Robles, he started, it's a long story, but he started monitoring spiny lobsters out there, and it has to do with some MPA designations. So we have a sea grant project. And so we actually go out every year to monitor the InterTidal, because it's actually the foraging habitat for female lobsters that are brooding eggs in the spring and the summertime. But yeah, we don't have trouble getting out there. We work through USC Wrigley, and then we have permits to get out there. But if they want to reach out to us, they're more than welcome to. But we've never had them reach out to us.
Excellent. Well, we better move on because we have a packed hour here. Thanks again, Corey. That was, again, excellent as always. Really appreciate it.